Have you ever sat down to play a nice game of Catan or Risk, only to get absolutely destroyed by the specter of your long-dead relative, who also happens to be French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte? No? Well, that's okay, neither have I. But my man Fred, well, he's in a bit of trouble. You see, Fred is a descendant of Napoleon, a Napo baby, if you will. And after losing at a board game, Napoleon's genetic memory bursts forth from Fred, upset that his relative could be so bad at strategy. And now it is our job, or I guess Raz's job, to help Fred win so that he can regain control of himself, which is how Raz makes his way to Waterloo World. Welcome back to my series of deep dives into the beautiful minds of Psychonauts. This week, we're taking a look at the mind of Fred Bonaparte, and playing some board games to help him regain his self-confidence as well as the respect of a long-dead ancestor. If this is your first video you've watched in these deep dives, then hello, welcome, hi. Feel free to keep watching or go back and watch all the other videos. They're all pretty solitary. You can watch them in any order you want to. I don't really care. This is also your once per episode reminder that there will be spoilers ahead, so if you haven't played Psychonauts and you don't want to be spoiled, then turn back or proceed at your own caution, I guess. I don't know. I can't tell you what to do. Now, it is game, set, and match for Waterloo World. Wait, that's a tennis thing, not a board game thing. Whatever. Let's dive in. Fred, oh my Fred. I love that man. Fred is the second piece of our current quest to disguise Raz like Dr. Lobato so he could sneak into the secret laboratory, which is actually guarded by Crispin Whitehead, an ex-asylum patient turned head orderly. I only bring up Crispin now because he actually plays a really important role in Fred's current predicament, which we will dive into a bit deeper in just a moment. For now, our focus for this episode is all on Fred, who seems to just have a few screws loose in my medical opinion, which is virtually worthless because I am not a doctor. But similar to Gloria von Guten, who we explored last episode, and Boyd Cooper from the episode before that, Fred represents another real-life mental health condition, which, in my humble opinion, appears to be dissociative identity disorder, resulting in two distinct personalities fighting for control of Fred's mind. First off, we have Fred himself, and then we have Napoleon, who seeks to reclaim his family's honor. What I really appreciate about Fred, as well as all the other asylum patients, is that with all of them, we learn of a breaking point in their lives that caused a switch up in their mental health. With Fred specifically, though, I really appreciate the switch up that they pull on the player if you decide to read into his background through his mental vaults as well as context clues. When we first meet Fred, he is a little bit busy fighting with himself, tied up in a restraint jacket. The scene that plays when you enter the room also introduces us very briefly to the next mind we will visit, Edgar Tegley, who is currently in art therapy. But for now, Fred seems to be mostly in control of himself. Unless he says something that Napoleon disagrees with, which is when he takes control of the body and fights back against Fred. Interestingly, Fred is dressed up in an outfit mimicking that of the French military, specifically the large hat and shoulder pieces that Napoleon was seen wearing in many paintings. I have a few questions about how Fred actually got these costume pieces. Maybe he just had them sitting around because he knew he was related to Napoleon. Maybe it's just for a fun visual gimmick, but it definitely clues us in that Napoleon is able to control more than just Fred's mouth. He can also seemingly control the body, but even Fred doesn't have that much control right now since he is tied up in a straitjacket. When we talk to Fred, we can learn a little bit more about his situation with Napoleon, brought to you by the fact that Fred is terrible at strategy, much to the chagrin of his relative. So, now it's time to actually dive into Fred's mind and look at Waterloo World. When first entering Waterloo World, it appears to be a really small level, just like Napoleon's stature. But the level expands in some really interesting ways. We finally get to see Napoleon in the flesh here, and in stark contrast to Fred, who is extremely tall and lanky, he is short and stout. A lovely bit of visual symbolism, and one that we actually see quite a lot in Psychonauts, weirdly enough. I haven't touched on it really at all, but height and size tend to play a really fascinating role in the messages of Psychonauts. A great example of this is the main camp counselors, Sasha, Mia, and Kroller. They're all taller and skinnier, while Oleander, who is a villain in the game, is shorter and rounder. The villain in Gloria von Guten's mind, the critic Jasper, is a large round man who masquerades as a skinny man. And then, once he's defeated, we see him shrunken down, tiny, but still very round, sitting inside a little popcorn bucket. The idea of small voices having a lot of power is a very real idea when it comes to mental health. I think everyone has those little voices in the back of their heads that nag them or self-sabotage. Oftentimes, problems seem much bigger than they are, but when we look at them as they are so much smaller than they seem. In this case, Fred is the bigger person, and Napoleon is just a tiny problem in his head acting much bigger than he actually is. The problem for Fred right now, though, is that he can't seem to beat Napoleon at a game of strategy. So, just inside Fred's mind, we find the pair sitting over a table, playing the game, locked in battle for control over Fred's mind. But Fred seems close to giving up because he has no confidence in himself to beat Napoleon at the game. So, Raz has to help him. Once again, this level plays with size, both the deceptive nature of the design of the level, but also the way size plays a role in our perception of the world. To help Fred, Raz can hop into the game board, shrinking in size, and then play on Fred's behalf to beat Napoleon, which sets us off on one of my favorite journeys in Psychonauts. I think the thing in this level that appeals to me most is my love of board games and also video games like Civilization. I love a good strategy game, as long as it isn't real-time strategy. I am garbage at those. But the other element I absolutely love about the level is this sort of RPG quest that Raz has to take on to recruit troops for Fred's army. In order to win the game, Raz needs to recruit soldiers, a carpenter, a knight, and several snails, a French delicacy. And none of the level is very hard necessarily, but it does make use of every single skill Raz has in his arsenal. I think that Waterloo World is actually the first level to use every ability, except for the one ability we haven't unlocked yet. I think that can lead to a little bit of tedium in the level design simply because with only 3 ability slots available, there ends up being a lot of switching skills onto hotbars. And while that can be annoying, I actually think it adds a bit to the strategy element of the level. It feels like kind of a backwards way to look at things from a design perspective, but that extra tedium really does add to this level for me in a good way. It slows me down as a player, forcing me to re-strategize the abilities that I want to prioritize at any given moment. However, I will say that one thing that genuinely does hold this level back is some of the platforming. Not that it's poorly designed necessarily, on the contrary, I like a lot of it in theory, but the age of the game really does show in this level. Raz's first quest is to recruit a carpenter, but the carpenter thinks that Raz is just a burglar trying to break into his home because he can hear footsteps on the roof. In order to get the carpenter on our side, we have to go up on his roof and stop the real burglar. Along the way, that requires some platforming between buildings and some tightrope walking, but the ladder we need to climb to start this whole process is kinda busted as hell. Every time I tried to climb the ladder while recording for this video, I got stuck at the top with the game glitching out and knocking me back down the ladder. Weirdly enough, I encountered a similar glitch in Shrek 2 for PC, although in that case it completely broke the game as there was no way to progress. Thankfully here, there are other ways up the ladder, and sometimes the ladder does work as intended, but it's certainly glitchy as hell. There are other moments, especially near the end of the level, where the platforming just gets a little bit frustrating, especially the platforming section around the outside of the castle, where some jumps need to be specific or you might just tap a wall and it'll drop you down, so you have to redo the whole section. It's not incredibly hard, it just has the potential to be annoying, so I can easily see this being the most annoying part of the level. Going back to the carpenter and his burglar problem though, an interesting little tidbit is that on the carpenter's roof there's this large sensor and also a memory vault. You might think that the sensor would be the burglar who's stomping on the roof, but the trigger for the quest is actually tied to the memory vault. So this is one of the few situations in the game where you're actually forced to open a memory vault to progress. Genuinely, I think the only other time in the game you have to open a memory vault is in the very first level, Basic Braining. So, since we're opening this memory vault anyway, let's talk a little bit about Fred Bonaparte now, and why he is the way he is. The first memory vault is called Fred vs. Crispin, and shows the history between Fred and Crispin Whitehead, who is currently blocking our path. We learn that Fred was once the head orderly at Thorny Towers, where one day he met Crispin locked up in a padded cell. As an inmate, Crispin had been unresponsive, and so Fred made it his goal to connect with him, and he did so by playing a board game titled Waterloo. After setting up the game, the pair played and Crispin easily beats Fred, leading to a fierce competition for Fred to win. Now, unlike most other memory vaults, the second memory vault in the level, titled Fred vs. Napoleon, picks up basically right after the first vault. Well, by right after, I mean it actually picks up 26 games later because Crispin has beaten Fred 27 times in a row. Absolutely brutal. Fred finally gives up, humiliated, and then we see Fred look in the mirror where Napoleon looks back at him. I absolutely love this scene because it reminds me a lot of Evil Dead 2, where an evil version of Ash Williams grabs himself through the mirror, but it also raises an interesting thought in my head. I genuinely don't know how dissociative identity disorder works. Like I said, I'm not a doctor or a psychologist. So all I know is its representation in movies and TV shows, which I can't imagine is wholly accurate. If someone with multiple personality disorder looks at themselves in the mirror, who or what do they see? I genuinely don't have an answer to that question, but if for some reason a doctor or a psychologist or someone who is suffering from DID is watching this, please let me know. I genuinely am just really curious. Anyways, Napoleon attacks Fred through the mirror, taking control of Fred, resulting in him then being locked up in Thorny Towers alongside Crispin. While this isn't exactly clear, Dr. Lobato has since appointed Crispin as head orderly, which also means protecting the entrance to his secret lair. The way it's portrayed, Fred's condition is a constant back and forth struggle in his own mind, but with Fred's lack of willpower, it's more like he's stepping aside and letting Napoleon take control, not even trying to win anymore. Something that I really appreciate about Waterloo World is the way that not only are we helping Fred deal with the Napoleon problem, we're also helping to improve Fred's self-confidence, which is actually an idea we see a lot throughout the game. The self-confidence is a much smaller issue, but I think it's just as important because it shows us as players that everyone has these problems, big or small. Of course, insinuating that the players could have the problems like these too. Instead of trying to demonize, the game attempts to normalize the problems. Understanding that everyone is going through something in their life puts us all on an equal level as human beings. You don't have to suffer from the same problems as someone like Fred to understand and to empathize, the same way that Fred, if he were real, could understand and empathize with your problems. That's another part of Fred's characterization that I love. Given who he is, or I guess who he was, he's prone to empathy. He was the head orderly at the asylum, and it's made very clear from the memory vaults that he cared deeply about the patients, which is why he tries to help Crispin in the first place. When we meet him as well, Fred is very quick to offer to help Raz, but he can only help once his problem with Napoleon is fixed. We're all human beings, and although we are all different in dealing with our own issues, we always have that one factor that connects us all and should make us all equal. The mind of Fred Bonaparte really emphasizes that for me. Now, let's get back to the level itself, because I feel like I've focused mainly on Fred himself so far, which is fair. I mean, it is his level, but there's a lot to be said about the world's design too. As I mentioned earlier, Waterloo World is designed in 3 heights. There is the room you enter into when you first enter Fred's mind, then there is the game board, where Raz remains bigger than most objects, and finally, there is the smallest form, where Raz shrinks down to become the size of the world itself, allowing interaction with different board elements. In order to beat the level, you need to interact with the world on all levels, and that does involve a fair amount of back and forth. Thankfully, the level does make it pretty easy and seamless to move between layers. I already mentioned it, but the RPG and strategy elements are what really shine for me in this level. They also help to facilitate the need to change layers. For example, when recruiting soldiers, sometimes you need something that exists on the outside of the board game. Like one soldier wants to be paid, so you have to leave the board to find money to pay him. It's such a fun take on the board game idea that builds on Fred as a character, but it's also just a fun, isolated adventure. We'll get down to the actual numbers of it all at the end, but Waterloo World does have the most figments in the entire game, and I'll be honest, some of them can be an actual pain to get. But in collecting them, I actually saw so much more of this level than I'd ever seen before. A lot of figments are up in the air, and you have to get creative with levitation to float and reach them. So there does end up being a lot of jumping off high places only to need to climb up again and then jump back down. It's kind of a pain. One of the final steps in beating the board game is recruiting a knight to capture the castle. But to do that, we have to get him a bucket of a French delicacy. Snails, which brings me to the orchard, my favorite and least favorite part of the level. And this goes back to a few things I mentioned previously, the RPG quest design and then the figments. The visit there is easy enough if you just want to grab your snails and leave. You simply use telekinesis to grab 10 snails to serve to the knight. It's a really funny moment and a very pretty area. I think it's the most unique section of the level except for maybe the castle, because so many of the different elements of the board game are just copied and pasted a little bit, like houses will look the same and bridges will look the same, things like that. But then there are the stupid figments. There are a ton of figments hiding in the trees as apples. Some of them are fully inside the trees and nearly impossible to see. That is one part of what makes the figment collection so needlessly brutal. You just can't see the figments you need. Now, I actually didn't know this until I went back to finally go and collect all the figments, but you can actually hit the trees to make the figments fall because they look like apples, so it's like knocking apples from trees. But I feel like that would have saved me so much time in my first playthroughs of the game if I had known that. But also, just the fact that the figments aren't even visible sometimes, so you can't even tell if the figments are there in the first place, and you kind of have to just trial and error to get it, can be a little bit annoying. If I had to make a recommendation for this level, don't waste your time trying to get every figment, unless you really want to 100% the game. It just takes a long time. But as I said, it did lead me to some cool discoveries. There are so many great tiny details in the board game world that I feel like I've just overlooked for years. I think the biggest one to me is the fact that there's just a giant brain bender sitting in some random window. I'd never even seen this ladder before on the back of this building, and when I climbed, I literally just sat for a second like, wait a damn minute. Inside this random window, you could see into the room where Fred and Napoleon are playing the board game. It's infinite. It's like looking into an endless abyss, but instead of darkness, all you could see is a tall skinny dude and a short fat dude playing the hit board game Waterloo. I don't know why this was messing with my brain so much, and I know it literally doesn't matter as it's probably just an Easter egg put in by the devs, but what does this imply about the brain? My completely baseless theory is that the loop repeats for every time that Fred has lost. Inside of each board game is another attempt where Fred lost, going down deeper and deeper. Again, completely baseless, just my fun little interpretation of a meaningless thing. The only thing that adds any credence to my theory is that if you go all the way out to the first layer, into the room with Fred, and you look out the window, you can once again see the board game outside the window. So maybe we are just stuck in another attempt. It's a crazy random detail, but I love it. Once we beat the board game, and beat Napoleon, despite his cheating attempts, Napoleon admits that Fred may be a true Bonaparte after all, and he frees Fred's mind. Fred also has this huge self-confidence boost, so in the level we didn't just help with Fred's mental problems, we also helped with his personal problems. It's a win-win. As a small note, in the final stages of the game, starting with Lungfishopolis and going through the very end, Fred's mind is the only one that doesn't have a boss fight at the end, which I think signifies a much deeper struggle for him. Unlike levels that lead up to a boss fight, the whole level was the boss fight for Fred, facing off against one singular, always present opponent. But seeing as Napoleon wasn't actually real, Fred himself was the boss battle, fighting himself all along, and we help untangle that whole mess. I think that's honestly just a really cool idea, where other boss battles pit us against outside forces like Cochamera, or inner sabotage like the Phantom. Fred's battle feels much more nuanced because he isn't battling a person or a feeling, but himself. Outside of Fred's mind, he gives us his straitjacket and says he will actually take care of Crispin, which would make all the item collecting useless, but Fred instead decides to take a nap. Maybe his laziness is another personal problem we could take care of by rooting around in his mind, but it doesn't matter for now. Waterloo World is, I think, in terms of its design, the most unique level in the game. As opposed to the several levels that send us from point A to point B, Waterloo sets us up with small tasks in a game of a completely different genre, although with some platforming thrown in because of course they had to. In total, there are 243 figments, which as I already mentioned is the most of any level in the game. There are also 7 mental cobwebs, 5 pieces of emotional baggage, and 2 memory vaults. From an outside perspective, Waterloo World feels like a level that might get a mixed reaction, and I can understand why. It's a level that definitely changes the pace of the game, and that can definitely throw players off who aren't looking for that kind of gameplay experience. For me though, Waterloo World's uniqueness is what makes me look at it so fondly. It's a nice little foray into something different that, for me, more than distract, showcases the developer's creativity and makes me excited to play more games. Psychonauts 2 has some levels like that which really play with different ideas and gameplay. Specifically, one that I absolutely love from Psychonauts 2 is Compton's Cook-Off, which once again flips the script and has a design completely unique from every other level in the game. I think I have to give Waterloo World an A on my completely arbitrary tier list, which is really starting to fill up now. Only 2 levels left to go. Next up, we are heading into the mind of Edgar Tegley as he deals with a bowl problem, and also a cheerleader problem, and also an art problem. He's got a lot to deal with. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and you haven't seen the previous videos in the series, then please go back and watch those. You can find a link to all of them in the description or just in the playlist tab of my YouTube page. It's all there. If you want to find me other places online, I stream fairly often over on Twitch. And you can also find me on my website where I write about things sometimes. Until next time, we're almost done with this series. So once again, thank you so much, and I will see you all in Black Velvetopia.